I think we can laugh a little bit at this debate. Check this out. Dave Smith and Vaush debated Ukraine on Breaking Points. Now, Ryan Grimm and Emily are moderators for this debate. This is an interesting conversation. Dave Smith is just going on to all these different shows, just knocking people the fuck out. So prepare yourself for this one. But the question is, should America continue to fund Ukraine? I say no. Let's hear what they had to say. Let's dive in. This is funny.
The difference in this new Cold War environment is that no one in the upper echelons of power in America seems to have any respect for this threat and any respect for, you could think to yourself, well, maybe this will work out in a positive way that the U.S. is greenlighting attacks inside of Russia. Or perhaps it could be an absolute disaster. And we're playing with, when I say we're playing with fire, it's an understatement. We're flirting with potentially the most disastrous thing that could happen to the human species. If America is to have any role in this conflict, it should be working toward a peaceful negotiation. And in fact, the American role and the Western role has been to kill peaceful negotiations from the beginning of this war and to prolong the fighting. I think that, as John Mearsheimer said back in 2014, the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path has turned out to be the most accurate prediction on this entire conflict. And essentially, I think since the fall of the Soviet Union, American foreign policy, and just keep in mind, American foreign policy in the Clinton administration and in the W. Bush administration and Obama's administration, these are the same people who are in charge of the Middle East. And in fact, the neoconservatives were very focused on NATO expansion back in the 90s. You can go read the Project for a New American Century documents. And the same people who totally blundered foreign policy in the Middle East have totally blundered foreign policy in Europe, provoking Vladimir Putin and the Russians at every turn, leading to this awful place that we're in. That is certainly, if you care about the Ukrainians at all, has been more of a disaster for the Ukrainian people than anyone else.
And Dave, Vaush made a point that I think you hear a lot from defenders of U.S. support for the Ukrainian war, and that is you can't allow other countries, you can't reward other countries for invading other countries. You just can't do that. We can't have that. What's the response to that? We can't have that argument.
How are you rewarding them by choosing peace? Because let's all remember there were the Minsk Accords. Let's remember that there were negotiations in place. There were talks of negotiations in place before the invasion. And this is not to say that Russia necessarily did the right thing, but the United States government prevented that peace from happening. The United States government were the ones that instigated the coup with NATO. The United States government did not want peace. So we always have to go back to that. And I don't see it as though we are rewarding Russia if we do not give funding to Ukraine. No, I would say again, like if the United States government had not been involved in this conflict with NATO from the beginning, I'm going years back. I'm not talking about what happened just almost 2 years ago. I'm going years back. The U.S. government and NATO initiated this. The U.S. government and NATO initiated this entire thing. So if we go back and we remove the U.S. government and NATO's intervention, we don't have this war. So that's just kind of how I see it.
Well, I mean, first, I would just point out how absurd it is that after the last 20 years of terror wars, somehow the United States of America still gets to put itself in the position of global peacemaker, as if our major concern is that bigger nations can bully smaller nations. I mean, over the last 20 years, there's been no greater purveyor of violence than the United States of America, who has imposed its will on tiny, helpless nations across the world. As far as that, yeah, it's not good that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. And yes, certainly that's something we don't want to see. My argument would be that America and the West more broadly had many opportunities, many off-ramps to put this fire out or at least calm it down. And at every single turn, poured more gasoline on this fire. That ultimately resulted in the invasion in 2022.
Yeah, so Vaush, how can the U.S. say with a straight face that it's not okay for other countries to invade smaller countries?
Well, I think it's kind of a cowardly non-argument, because I'm not arguing in favor of the moral superiority of the United States. That'd be a ridiculous position for me to take. It's not football. We're not taking sides like, waving banners. There are two levels to this when it comes to agency. We're concerned about the broader socioeconomic and geopolitical context that led to where we are now. And that goes back to the Cold War and even earlier. If we listen to Putin's justifications for the invasion, it goes back to the borders of the Russian Empire, And then there's like the immediate decision making. We mustn't remove agency from the equation. Russia invaded, by Putin's own words, in a sort of territorial land grab. The idea that it was entirely because of a response to Western aggression or NATO posturing is ridiculous and ahistorical. But that doesn't mean the West isn't responsible for helping to create the situation we're in now. We have to balance these two justifications. Our arrogance after the end of the Cold War, the fact that rather than reaching out to Russia as a potential future ally, we ostracized, with the shock therapy, the sort of economic devastation of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet states. These contributed to an environment in which future conflict was inevitable. It was reprehensible on the part of the Western governments to participate in this. Look today at the divide between former West and Eastern Germany. I mean, the reason that East Germany is voting so heavily for the AfD is in large part because they see it as a rejection of the doctrine of the West that left them behind after reunification. These should all be taken into account. And we must acknowledge that Putin is a fascist who did a territorial land grab. Those two facts don't contradict each other. They work together to create a complete narrative. With regards to the invasion now, I agree we have to take the threat from Russia seriously. And by that, I mean, we don't want this to scale out infinitely. We don't want this to turn into a global war. That's something we have to take seriously. At the same time, we have to acknowledge Russia does too. And their constant threats of nuclear war, the fact that they started this invasion, the fact that they have been posturing and acting aggressive towards Finland, towards the Baltic states, even like ramping up aggression towards the rest of Western Europe, we must consider again their agency.
Let's talk about aggression, shall we? First of all, on this show, I'll be the first to let you know that Russia is not your enemy. If anything, we are the enemy to most countries in the world. When we talk about, ramping up aggression, Russia doesn't have 800 bases around the world. That's the United States government. We're the ones that are the aggressors. We're the ones that have bases in all these different military bases in all these different countries. How would you guys feel if another country had all of these bases in the United States? How would you feel? How would you feel if like Russia or China, or I'm trying to pick countries that are not a part of the West Alliance? How would you feel if China or Russia had all these bases in inside the United States and surrounding the United States? How would you feel about that? Wouldn't that make you feel some kind of way? I don't know. It would just kind of make me feel like, why are you guarding me, man? Right. So the U.S. government, we have always, for the most part, as much as I can remember, we particularly are the aggressor. We are the ones that are surrounding all these countries. We are the ones that send our military forces into these countries to the point where not only do they have bases, but they have housing, they have stay. I know I came from a military family. And then, well, what are you there for? To do what? Well, what are you trying to do? So I never saw it that way. I never saw Russia as an aggressor. If anything, I've always felt like the United States government, we're the ones that are the aggressors. We're the ones that are trying to police the entire world.
Now, I think that in the long run, there is a very deleterious consequence to creating an incentive structure where Putin gets to boost his national rep, his prestige, with a successful land grab in Ukraine. I think it would have been disastrous if he could have just marched west and taken the territory, because it would have reaffirmed and rewarded all the worst possible behaviors from him. That doesn't mean I think that we should sort of do a victory lap around Russia. Cold War II, let's win, let's trounce them in Ukraine. I do think that we're in a tough situation because we can't just magically make Russia, I guess, a democracy or a country less incentivized to invade its neighbors or reclaim historical territory.
I want you to think about what he just said there, because that is a terrible talking point. We can't just make Russia a democracy. First of all, let's think about the way that was framed. Why are you thinking about changing another country? This is one of the problems that the U.S. government has now, this constant intervention, trying to tell these countries what they have to become. That's totally their decision. Who are we to even talk about democracy? We live in a country where they won't even let third party and independent candidates be on the fucking ballot or the debate stage. They can change the rules whenever they want to. Our politicians are owned by AIPAC, the military industrial complex, and Wall Street. So who are we to talk about a democracy? That's bad framing. When you say that, well, we're in a difficult spot because we can't make Russia be a democracy. How about you keep your hands out of Russia? How about you keep your hands out of these other countries and let these countries be? Leave these countries alone. That sounds like a NATO talking point to me.
Difficult question, which is why I don't like simple answers.
So, Dave, actually, here's an interesting point that Vaush just raised about the beginning of the war. And, you know, if we may all agree, correct me if I'm wrong, that we all think it would have been bad if Putin had indeed marched into Kyiv and took all of Ukraine, et cetera. But that leads us to the question, Dave, of how much U.S. involvement, if any, was just. If we agreed that it was good for the U.S. to perhaps prevent the Russian capture of Kyiv, et cetera, at what point did it become too much? At what point is the support no longer just or moral? How do you respond to that, Dave?
I think that the point that you could start at a lot of different points. I think the first round of NATO expansion was unjust and was unnecessarily provocative of the Russians. I'm not exactly sure what Vaush is referring to as like a cowardly non-argument. I simply was directly responding to Ryan's point. If you have a serial killer who's killed far more people than another serial killer, and they claim that they're trying to stop a serial killer because they're so against killing, it's reasonable to point out that, no, this is in fact not what's motivating U.S. foreign policy, that no, the butcherers of Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Somalia and Libya and Yemen are not actually motivated by some sense of we can't let big guys pick on little guys. Let's have an honest conversation about what's really motivating this policy. And it has been, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, to increase the power of the American empire. And Russia has always been seen as a force that's outside of the American empire. That's what's been motivating American foreign policy. This is what we're living through here, is largely the neoconservative doctrine. It was the worst thing that ever happened in the history of our country, is that after we became probably the first ever true global superpower, about 10 years later, the neoconservatives got control of our foreign policy. And this was their plan from the very beginning. So no, I don't think America should have been involved in Ukraine at all. And I certainly don't think that that anything we've done has done anything except make this situation much worse and much, much more dangerous, because now you are experiencing a proxy war with the two biggest nuclear superpowers. I don't think saying any of that is reducing things down to simplistic worldview. And of course, Vaush, you kind of snuck a straw man in there. I wouldn't say that this conflict is entirely because of NATO expansion, but to pretend like that's not a major driving factor in this conflict is to not be dealing with reality. And this has been admitted by all of the top people on both sides. And this was why so many people within the national security apparatus in the 90s opposed the first round of NATO expansion, explicitly because this will provoke a reaction from the Russians. Through the years, the Russians have been crystal clear that Ukraine was their red line. Thanks to the greatest journalist of the 21st century, the hero Julian Assange, who is thankfully now a free man, we know that the current head of the CIA, Burns, told Condoleezza Rice this explicitly, that this was a red line, and not a red line in the way that America makes up red lines. Like Obama will say, if Assad uses a certain type of weapon on his people, that's a red line for us. It's all just ridiculous. This is a red line in a true sense, in the sense that Jack Kennedy said, putting nuclear missiles in Cuba is a red line for us. We will blow up the world if you try to do that. Vladimir Putin, and as Burns pointed out, not just Vladimir Putin, the entire Russian establishment has been unanimous on this, that they will not tolerate Ukrainian entry to NATO. And look, it's not justified or reasonable for Vladimir Putin to have launched this war, but on the scale of geopolitical demands, the demand that Ukraine cannot be a part of the American empire's military alliance was a fairly reasonable one. And we could have avoided this whole war by just committing to that.
They have constantly continued to poke the bear. They've been poking Vladimir Putin. They've been poking Russia for years. And he's correct about that red line. That was never supposed to happen. We wouldn't be here again. So I guess the US government just feels like they can continue to poke and poke and poke and poke people and expect them not to eventually respond. And you just see, this is how we got here. They look at Russia the same way they look at China. They look at those particular countries as a threat because economically they're powerful. When you look at the sanctions that have been applied to Russia during the war, doesn't seem to be hurting Russia, does it? Russia's economy doesn't seem to be struggling after those sanctions. Then you have a country like China, which economically they are becoming a contender. They don't really need us the way that we need them. We don't even really make a lot of things in this country anymore. Yes, there's efforts to bring manufacturing back, but it'll never be the way that it was before. So this idea of world domination, which is fueled by a military industrial complex, is what causes this. At the end of the day, you have to remember, we got to get back to the money. The US government sees war as a profit. Peace is not profitable for the military industrial complex. They make money by having wars. They make money by starting wars. So for me, at the end of the day, it's not even a question of, should we continue to fund Ukraine? Should we continue to me, it's just all of the money needs to be removed, period. You have to remove it. But as long as you continue to have military industrial complex, this will always be a problem. So it's upsetting. It's frustrating because I do feel like at the end of the day, they're not getting back to the root issue, which is the money. A lot of people are focusing on rather who's right, Russia, Ukraine. Is it Zelensky? Is it Putin? Who's right here? But you have to get back to the core issue of why this happened in the first place. Money. Why would the US government and NATO reject any type of peace negotiations from the get-go? Money. There's no money in peace. We all got to say it. Say it with me. There is no money in peace. Let's continue.
Quick follow-up on that, Dave. So
sure,
all things, we're dealing in the reality that we did push for the NATO expansion in 2014 and all of that considered. Is your position that there should have been basically zero aid, military, whatever else, government aid to Ukraine after the invasion a couple of years back? Basically just none.
Absolutely. If there was any role for the Americans to play, it would have been trying to negotiate an end to the war. Unfortunately, if you're putting me in the hypothetical of you can't change anything before this, but you're already here, we had probably blown all of that goodwill and there were better parties who would have been more suited for that. For example, going back to even the Bucharest summit in 2008 into the beginning of the Maidan Revolution, Germany was much more hesitant to get involved, to go down this path. There were other European countries who were kind of hey, let's not provoke the Russians. It's part of the reason why Ukraine didn't get a full map invitation in 2008 is the objection of the Germans. So probably someone else would have been better at it. Yes, essentially what I'm saying is that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, the most war-hungry country in the world, the United States of America, shouldn't have been the ones at the table at all. And there might have been some goodwill from other parties who had more of an interest to avoid this catastrophe.
And if I may, there are elements of this that I guess don't make sense to me. First of all, the claim that America's decision-making is based on it trying to expand its own geopolitical power rather than any altruistic interest. That's true, but that's also the case for all countries. That's basic IR theory. So the idea of this neocon theory of America expanding its interest, that's just nation states. Russia's doing that right now. India's doing that. China's doing that. Everyone's doing that. We're better at it because we're a superpower, of course. But that's a fundamental rule of national exchange. I don't think that it's really a moral question. It's a matter of material conditions in a basic Marxist sense. Who's motivated by what and where they are. In the modern world, the imperial sphere of influence extends to the entire planet. American jets can reach any part of the world in 24 hours. Everyone's can if they have jets. There's no we get the nation next to us, which makes me think the idea that like Ukraine is more innately in the Russian sphere of influence is, I think it's a little bit old hat. At the end of the day, the people in Ukraine were interested in closer relations with the EU, and that is ultimately what triggered everything from Euromaidan, Yanukovych fleeing the annexation of Crimea, the invasion of the Donbass following the invasion of Ukraine broadly. This is, again, a complicated situation. I don't mean to detract from the influence that Western arrogance had in it. I would never try to do that. But I do.
No, it was all triggered and initiated by NATO. NATO pushed this. It's like, oh my God. Oh my gosh. Let's continue on.
I think that like your roadmap for how things should have progressed from an American perspective following the 2022 invasion is misguided, because I don't think the world would be any farther from annihilation if Russia had simply marched westward, taken Kyiv, and we had a bunch of ginned up Russian soldiers right up against the border of Poland, you know, having just successfully annexed former Soviet/Russian imperial territory. You could imagine the propaganda coming out of the Kremlin about how they're reuniting their people. They're sort of like expanding the Russian interest in like a Duginist ethnic sense, you know, reclaiming the empire. I think that like the incentive structure behind that would be really bad. Like that, you're basically you're throwing chum into the water for sharks. You know, Putin is expansionist. He's been sort of like preempting this for a long time with Georgia. You know, with his behavior with the Chechens. I don't think that would bring us any closer to peace. Now, is the current path we're on right now the best possible road? Obviously not. Nothing we ever do is the best possible road, but I think it's closer to threading that line than just letting them march westward with Ben. What I'm interested in, I guess, is practical solutions now outside.
Pause. Let's talk about something here, because they always continue to bring up Poland. I want to remind everyone, if we're looking back into that 2018 letter that was signed by several congressmen and women, where they expressed that they were deeply concerned about the rise or increase of Nazification in Poland and Ukraine. And I mentioned this because all of a sudden those politicians, after this war started with Russia and Ukraine, seemed to all of a sudden forget that there's Nazification in Ukraine. Whenever they were questioned about it, there was like, there's no Nazis in Ukraine. Bruh, you signed this letter. It's your signature on this letter saying that you were concerned about the increase in Nazification in Poland and Ukraine. We go back to the interview that Vladimir Putin had with Tucker Carlson. One of the things that Vladimir Putin said was that he focused heavily on they were praising Nazis. Like in the country, they were praising Nazis in Ukraine to the point where they had statues that were made of these guys. So everybody that keeps pointing the finger at Russia, and there's criticism that you can make of Russia, but when it comes to this particular conflict, it's interesting that the same people that are willing to say there's no Nazification in Ukraine, or is very few Nazis in the Azov battalion, they clearly don't understand the culture and the history of Ukraine. I've read about it. There is Nazification in Ukraine. So there's that. But also, they seem to have forgotten that Russia actually fought against the Nazis. These are things I think that people need to continue to say. We have to reiterate this, because people are seriously out there trying to change history or rewrite history.
Of just letting Ukraine get annexed, which I really don't think would have been good for world peace in the long run, even if it would have quickly ended the conflict. How do we incentivize Ukraine and Russia to come to the table and bring an end to this war? Can Ukraine regain its lost territory? I think morally, it should be able to, because I don't like nations being rewarded for annexing adjacent territory. But logistically, can they? Would it be possible to end things where they are now? Would Russia keep Crimea and that just be seen as a kind of like dull historical injustice to fade away over time? And 100 years from now, people would be like, did you know Crimea used to be Ukraine? I don't know. There's so much dogmatism. And whenever you bring up like modern solutions, people go back to, I don't know, the end of the Cold War. I understand NATO is not exactly a global force for good, but what can we do now? I mean, I so rarely hear answers that are contextualized in the current moment.
Sure. Can I respond to that? Because
So my answer is in reference to what do we do now? We stop giving money to Ukraine. We stopped giving billions of dollars to Ukraine, especially since Zelensky has already announced, he's on video now saying we need to work towards some type of peaceful resolution. Yeah, that's another one. I can pull it up in a second if you want. But now he's changing his mind on that and saying there's too many people dead. We need to work towards some type of peaceful resolution. All this money that we've thrown out the door to Ukraine, knowing that there was no way they were going to beat Russia.
So there's a few that I want to answer your question at the end there, but just like a few things I want to point out. Number one, I think this is almost like bigger than just any political debate. There's it's a broader theme in life in general. I think anybody who's married, who's on the show or listening to the show knows this is true in personal relationships. There's a tendency if you're in an argument with your wife or your husband or something like that, to focus on what they did and what they did that's bothering you. But a much more healthy posture, if you're in a successful relationship, is that you also add in like, okay, well, what am I doing? How am I participating in this? What have I done that's kind of led to this situation? Generally speaking, I think that if you look at the corporate media, you're going to hear all of this talk about what Putin's done. And I think a lot of times in these debates, people can kind of claim to be like, well, I have a more nuanced position. I'm not simplifying things. I think the point of saying that like, well, all governments are expansionist by nature, so there's no difference between the neoconservatives and say other groups of people. I'm not saying they're the same, but like a logical analogy, it's like, oh, well, all governments kill people. So like what Adolf Hitler's doing is just kind of the same as other governments. It's not exactly true. It's kind of different in scale and in kind. To sit here and say, and look, if we have time, we could go through the history of Chechnya and Georgia and all this stuff. But to zoom out a little bit, during the Cold War, we drew the line at the Elbe River, halfway through Germany. On one side was the Soviet Union, and on the other side was NATO. And we're now talking about Ukraine, and you could sit here with a straight face and say, Putin is expansionist. Okay. I mean, if that's how you want to look at it, it's like, let's just look at the actual reality of what's happening here. It's not that Putin has been this expansionist force. Putin has been almost at every turn reacting to the expansion of the American empire.
You got to give them agency, man.
Ukraine. That's just not true. It's not denying someone agency to say that they're responding to something. That doesn't make any sense at all.
Responding to everything. That's all life.
Sure.
No one just acts without you didn't fall out of a coconut tree.
That's just a cop-out. That doesn't mean anything.
You're the one providing the cop-out. You're saying that like it's not possible for Putin to have like a distinctly expansionist element to his rule because everyone's just responding to. So do you believe Putin has a distinctly expansionist element to his rule?
Okay, no, that's not a binary. One is it's not possible.
Wait, do you think he does or doesn't?
Hold on. So instead of just interrupting me, let me make the point. You just laid out a binary between is it possible he has expansionist intentions and does he have expansionist intentions? That's not a binary. There are some expansionist desires that he has. No, in fact, if you actually educate yourself on this topic. It was our CIA director who said in the Niet Means Niet memo leaked by Julian Assange that verbatim, this was a choice that Vladimir Putin did not want to have to make. This was a choice that Russia did not want to get involved in this war.
And yet he made the choice. He made the choice to invade, to bring troops down to the Ukrainian border, to commit to multiple years of come on, this is the thing. I ask you for what can we do now? And immediately it's back to the Iron Curtain.
Well, hold on.
I know.
Vash, hold on. Here's what happened. I'm sorry.
I just want to know in the modern context.
I get it. Actually, what happened was you made a long statement and ended with that question. And I said, let me answer that question. But first, let me deal with what you said at the beginning of your statement. And then you started interrupting me. So no, it's not that I'm not willing to answer that question. It's that I had to point out, I think, a lot of the errors that you're making. Now, if you want just to say, what could we do right now? Well, look, we're going to have to be realists about this situation and admit that Ukraine is losing this war and that they're not going to drive Russia out of Crimea. That's a joke. They're not going to drive Russia out of many of the territories that they've taken right now. We should be working toward a deal, a peaceful solution, which has been on the table several times throughout this war, and it's been the West who has been trying to squash it.
Well, that's
what we should do.
Not true at all, though. You've seen, I assume you've read the deals that Putin has put through. Zelensky hasn't been particularly amenable to them himself. The narrative that the West is squashing the peace deals, which is blown up largely because of that one Boris Johnson visit early on in the conflict. Don't get me wrong, okay? The West has its own interests. There are plenty of Western leaders who would like to see the Russian armories depleted. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine would have been jumping in the bit for any of the deals Putin's been offering since the war began. And Ukraine hasn't been losing. Both countries have been stalling. This has been like a slog, and it has been since the first, or after the first 3 months of the war. I don't like
raising my hand here because it's time for me to step in again and say this. If Ukraine hasn't been losing, why are they pulling random people off the street to go fight? They're running out of men to fight in this war, but they're not losing. Russia has plenty of people lined up. They still have people to fight, but they haven't been losing. All of those men dying to the point where they're grabbing men that are in their 40s to go fight, I'd say you're losing. I don't think that's stalling. And they're running out of people. I'll show you what Zelensky is saying recently in just a second. Let me let him finish here.
Like the narrative that Ukraine's losing, because the fact that they exist at all at this point, considering the Russian armaments aligned against them, is pretty impressive.
I mean, they're pulling guys off the streets to fight.
Oh, yeah, but and Russia has their penal colony forces with the Wagner group pulling from their multiple rounds of really unpopular conscriptions, waves of immigration out of Russia. People. No, of course not. I'm not arguing that it's a matter of our investment or whether or not it's moral. War makes, unfortunately, unethical decision-making of every side, including the good ones. The Allies did plenty of bad stuff during World War II. I'm only saying that it's been a slog for both sides. I don't want to see this out in I don't want this conflict to end in a way that's going to guarantee the conflict reemerges in 2 years. If you end up just setting the border right where the fighting lines are right now, we're going to be exactly where we were back in 2014. We're going to have a combination of paid separatists and Russian soldiers moving around in the Donbass. There's going to be constant exchanges of fire across the border. This needs a real international solution. I don't know whether that means a proper DMZ. I don't know whether that means genuine reconciliation. Ideally for me, it would be some kind of Hail Mary where Ukraine gets its borders back and there's a massive coming together between Russia and the West, and we reopen trade and negotiations, but that's a little bit of a pipe dream. We do agree that, at least let's agree on this. If the line just freezes where it is right now, are we not guaranteeing another conflict in a few years?
I don't know that that's possible to say, to be honest.
People be pretty mad. People be firing across the border.
It's not guaranteeing it. I don't know.
Ukrainians and Russians, especially at the front, are not positively disposed to each other. I feel like we need to give them something solid, a solid peace. Not just we've decided now the slog has gone on for too long. They'd be throwing rocks at each other across the border, You could get a 5-mile wide DMZ and they'd still be sending drones over with bricks to drop at each other's heads.
Maybe this is all.
I think we need to leave Russia and Ukraine alone and let them handle their own business. I think the we should be taken out of it. This is one of the problems with NATO. This is one of the problems. I mean, it wouldn't even be at this point if it wasn't for the aggression from NATO. Just like when I talk about Israel and Gaza, what I always tell you guys, who is the aggressor? Who was the one that has been the aggressor? It's been the state of Israel. Who has been the aggressor here? It has been NATO, constantly moving their borders closer and closer to Russia. So we got to take it back to that. However, that being said, Zelensky is starting to appear to change his mind. Let me bring this up here because, again, not because he necessarily just wants to stop fighting, but because they're running out of people. This is what I've been trying to explain, that they are running out of men. Let's go ahead and bring this up here. I have to pull down this video really quick. Hotspot captured this. Guys, if you haven't done so, make sure you follow Hotspot on Twitter. They have a lot of cool clips. So this is Zelensky talking about we need to move forward to a peace negotiation. This was recent. Listen.
We have to find and to prepare this plan and to put this plan on the table during months. We don't have too much time because we have a lot of wounded and dead people on the battlefield and through civilians. That's why we don't want to have this war during years. So that's why we want to prepare this joint plan, put it on the table to the second peace summit.
So again, all those people that have died, all those soldiers that have died, all the people that they've been dragging up off of the street, all the billions of dollars that has gone to Ukraine. And here's Zelensky telling you, oh, I think we need to try to bring some type of peace negotiation on the table because too many people have died. You knew that was going to happen. They knew there was no way they were going to be able to beat Russia from the get-go. All that money. Such a mess. New York Varsity says this clown won his election overwhelmingly on the premise of peace with Russia. There you go.